Salt, the rock we eat. While the vast majority of commonly purchased food items are organic, meaning that they're derived from carbon compounds other than CO2, and by and large come from other life forms, namely plants and animals, salt is the one exception. It is a grinded up rock that we eat as food, or more accurately, put on food. This whitish rock is not only essential for life on Earth, but also has had a profound impact on our history and cultures. Unless you failed middle school science class, you are probably well aware that sodium chloride is the scientific name for the salt we consume. And you probably recall vaguely from biology or health class that sodium chloride is one of the essential molecules we need in order for the body to maintain an equilibrium of body fluids. It's also essential for your nervous system and muscles. At certain times in the past, these minerals were rare and expensive, a tragedy for people who were struggling with salt deficiencies. Salt is cheap and ubiquitous today. However, we're actually consuming way too much of it because of how cheap and ubiquitous it is. And many of us, as a result, are struggling with high blood pressure, as well as an increased risk of heart disease and stroke. So how did this happen? A luxury commodity that has now become so banal that virtually anybody outside of the poorest people in the poorest countries in the most rural areas can find easily and afford it. And in fact, probably consume way too much of it. Now you're probably thinking, why was it so hard to find, despite the fact that there are gigantic oceans filled with salt, on top of lots of terrestrial areas filled with tons of salt beneath the ground, or perhaps even on the surface? The most spectacular of which, in my opinion, is a place I visited called the Uyuni Salt Flats of Bolivia, the world's largest mirror. There are even a handful of salt lakes, the two most famous being the Salt Lake of Utah and the Dead Sea between Israel, the West Bank, and Jordan. It's a fitting name since the high salinity of this area makes virtually any life outside of extremophiles like brine shrimp impossible. Other parts of the world have vast deposits of underground salt beds under other earth minerals. However, not everybody lives nearby a body of salt water or a terrestrial salt deposit or a salt lake, and the methods of extracting the salt at a time before industrialization were quite cumbersome, and as a result, salt became quite difficult for a large swath of people to gain a hold of. Hunter-gatherers probably had some trouble finding salt, depending on where they were located. But nonetheless, they would still get some salt primarily from animals. These animals were primarily herding animals who oftentimes would be in search of salt licks. These are salt deposits on the surface. They deposit not only salt, but other essential minerals that will attract these herding animals, and given the fact that humans were hunting these animals, humans would find these salt licks, extract salt from them, and also kill the animals licking the salt licks, or at the very least domesticate them and eat them later. Humans could acquire salt from the bones, milk, and meat of these animals in small quantities. However, gaining access to salt became a lot harder with agricultural people groups, as most people were relying on staple crops such as wheat, rice, and maize. Speaking of food, there were a variety of foods that were subject to spoilage. In fact, pretty much anything that has enough moisture for a microorganism to reside in it will eventually decompose and rot. So what's the solution? Well, salt is really good at sucking out the moisture of things. It makes them dry, and is known for its antimicrobial properties. Now keep in mind that at a time, people had no idea bacteria existed, but they were well aware that if you leave meat outside, it would rot and eventually give you food poisoning. Now let's go back in time. Back to a time when we didn't necessarily have written records, but rather had to rely on archaeological evidence in order to understand what was going on. There's some evidence dating back to around 8,000 years ago of people in the Eastern Balkans in what is now Romania and Bulgaria. One of the oldest sites is called Solnisata, which I'm mispronouncing. But putting aside my terrible pronunciation, it is quite possibly the oldest site of salt production. And it's not surprising that it was located in a fortified town. Salt, at the time, was extremely valuable, and you wanted to keep your precious salt stash guarded well. On top of that, the site also contains a great deal of gold. It is unclear whether the salt was traded in exchange of gold or perhaps if they were stashing their gold and their salt in the same location. Regardless of this, it's quite amusing that while gold would continue to retain its incredibly high value, salt, which by virtually every metric is far more important for the survival of humanity, is now cheap enough to be sold at the dollar store today. During the Bronze Age, you saw more complex sets of trade routes throughout much of the Eastern Mediterranean. And while much of the attention has been paid to copper and tin, which made up bronze, there was a thriving salt trade. You can see evidence of salt being traded between various people groups, such as the New Kingdom of Ancient Egypt, the Hittites, the Indo-European groups of what is now Greece, and the Phoenicians, among others. I mentioned the Eastern Balkans previously, but salt production would eventually be more prominent on the other side of the Balkans along the Adriatic Sea. The Adriatic is essentially part of the Mediterranean Sea between the Italian peninsula on one side and the Balkans/Greece on the other side. You don't need to be a history buff to know that this place has a lot of historical importance, or had a lot of historical importance during the ancient classical period. And it just so happens to be that the Adriatic Sea has higher salinity than much of the Mediterranean Sea, and the Mediterranean has higher salinity than the Atlantic Ocean. However, not as high as the Dead Sea, which would have made it inhospitable for settlements. Now, it would be silly to reduce the success of Greece and later Rome to easy access to salt. However, I would argue that it did play a significant role in the health and wealth provided to the people living there through these white chunks of rock that would play an important role in these cultures of classical antiquity, spreading their influence around much of the Mediterranean. There was even an ancient Roman road called Via Salaria, stretching from Rome to the Adriatic coast, and eventually would make its way to Greece through sea routes. These roads paved the way for international trade. Salt was perfect for this because it is 1. Highly profitable, at least at the time, 2. Non-perishable, and 3. A necessity. Keep in mind that these salt roads existed well before the Silk Road. Evidence for salt roads can be found across much of the world, connecting coastal saltwater ports to inland cities. Freshwater rivers eventually became transportation highways for salt, as many freshwater rivers empty into saltwater bodies. If the river was navigable, as many are in Europe, China, and the Indian subcontinent, salt would be extracted from saltwater bodies and then travel upstream. Freshwater bodies through boats would connect many of these river valley settlements to the shores. Other parts of the world without access to seaports would have salt roads. In many cases, these salt roads would connect certain mining towns close to alpine or desert areas with large salt deposits to areas that didn't have access to salt nearby. This can be seen in ancient civilizations such as the Kingdom of Aksum in Ethiopia or the Tibetan Plateau, parts of the world that are largely landlocked. Speaking of Tibet, I must refer to its current colonial overlord China, which has an incredibly rich history of salt production. The earliest Chinese writing systems, known as the oracle bones, oftentimes written on turtle shells, mention the production of salt and the salt trade. While the Adriatic was the most prominent producer of salt in Europe, the Bohai Sea, which I'm mispronouncing, which is an inlet of the Yellow Sea in northern China, not too far off the Korean peninsula, would also be famous for salt production, as the bay would have 15 different rivers emptying into it, producing a great deal of mineral deposits, resulting in higher salinity. This made the region fairly wealthy compared to other regions of China. A long history of valuing order and bureaucracy among various Chinese dynasties would see the use of salt production fill up their treasuries. However, at various points of Chinese history, there were varying levels of centralization and decentralization of salt production. Quite possibly the most famous area renowned for salt production in pre-modern times was not in China or in Europe, but West Africa, the region that produced various complex empires such as Ghana and Mali. You probably have heard of the city of Timbuktu, oftentimes used as a reference of faraway places that are important for some reason but you barely know anything about. Well, there is one thing you should know about it. Timbuktu was a major center of the salt trade, and it was located in the Sahel region. This is a region between the lush parts of Africa and the Sahara Desert. The large salt deposits and caravan trading posts would eventually turn these settlements into large cities capable of universities, temples, and mosques. This is where the famous story of Mansa Musa comes from, arguably the richest person adjusted for inflation in human history, who got rich largely in part due to the salt trade among other factors. During the early modern era, the newly founded Dutch Republic residing in the lowlands would eventually become the world's largest producer of salt, which it still is today, and part of the reason why the nation is so immensely wealthy, to the point where they could afford massive fleets that could sail across the world, including Southeast Asia, and set up the modern spice trades. After a while, salt gets boring and you want to add some nutmeg and cloves to your cooking. Much of the salt production was done and is still done through the use of solar evaporation, building up shallow pools of salt while letting it evaporate, extracting the salt beneath it. This method proved to be far more effective than the old school method of pan production from brine water, in which you literally have to get a pot of briny water and then let it evaporate, small quantity by small quantity. There are also other advances made in engineering which made salt mining inland far more productive, to the point that salt became far cheaper due to the high supply. In 1848, Morton Salt was founded in the city of Chicago, Illinois. They were able to sell salt at cheap prices at various markets. On top of that, you also saw the rise of ionized salt. This mixes various types of salt with iodine. This is because, while at the time, salt deficiency was no longer a major issue due to its abundance, iodine deficiency still was a recurring issue in many parts of the developing world. And iodine deficiency can spell havoc for your endocrine and nervous system. Today, there are various types of salt that are a little bit more atypical and slightly more expensive, such as Atlantic gray salt or kosher salt. The most popular today is probably Himalayan pink salt, which is produced primarily in Pakistan. Pink salt is a table salt that, like most other types of salt, does have traces of similar elements such as zinc and magnesium. However, contrary to popular belief, it isn't really any healthier than any other type of salt, at least to any significant degree. So don't believe the BS from health gurus. We have seen the rise of different spice mixtures from salt, such as celery salt, which mixes celery seeds with salt. We also have curing salts that usually contain sodium nitrite in order to preserve meat even better than the salts of the medieval world. We also have dairy salt, which is a byproduct of cheese and butter, a resource so plentiful that in the state of Wisconsin, they literally use it for melting snow. Many other types of salt exist in the world, and if you have any others you'd like to mention, please drop them off in the comments section. If there are any other ordinary, mundane items that you think are worthy of their own video, please tell me. Thanks for watching.